I'd like to begin with is just a brief review, just really brief from last week in the early church, right? And if you remember in the early church, liturgy essentially, I'm not going to do 1, 2, 3, but it began to follow Jewish synagogue practice, right? So a lot of the ways that they would practice religion in a synagogue with a reading, readings and prayer and whatever songs and stuff they did, Christian worship basically followed that. Eventually, as the church moved out and more into the Roman world, it ran up against persecution by the Romans because it wasn't an official religion, it wasn't an accepted religion. And so we moved to this house church, and even there we have documents like the Didache, which shows sort of a basic order, liturgy of worship, because that's what a liturgy is. But it was prayers, basically prayers, readings, a commentary by one of the leaders, and then communion. So Holy Communion was always part of that. In the early days, that communion was always connected to worship. It was also connected to a regular meal, a sit-down meal. And the Holy Communion was part of that. But then after the Edict of Milan in 312, when Constantine said, hey, Christians are no longer, they're now a protected religion, things changed. And over the next 60, 70 years before they became the state religion of Rome, it expanded and it went to sort of like the basilica worship, right? And basilicas, these bigger spaces, public spaces. And what happened in the basilica worship, then they started thinking about form and choreography. Choreography. And
2 hours.
So, but the idea, we're thinking about form. And if you think about it, when we walk with our worship now, some of the things we still do, this would be in this area here. So 1400 to 1700 years ago, some of those practices that happened then, we still do. The procession in, and especially higher churches, when they process in with the cross, that was a Roman, not only Roman, but that was a imperialist empire type of thing. The bigger seating, the people divided up the choirs. In the early house churches, they just sang. It's because they were small groups. When you got to bigger worships, what happened is then you needed singers to lead worship, and they began to develop choirs. The Schola Cantorum, which was the big Roman choir in Rome, a school of teaching, a school of cantoring. And cantoring is to lead prayer, lead worship. And these other forms that really have defined Christianity just begin to take on more nuance. During through the Middle Ages, I'll point out a couple things. For a while, the more formal liturgies developed around the different seats of power. There was the bishopric of Antioch, and the bishop of Egypt, and the bishop of Rome, and the bishop of Jerusalem, and the bishop of Constantinople. Eventually, when it came to not Constantine, Charlemagne, who, as emperor, says we're gonna make everything more unified. We started moving churches around, started moving towards more unified worship. By this time, they adopted the Roman style. It was out of that the Roman church began to gain an influence, and out of that eventually rose the seat of the papacy, which is the Bishop of Rome. The Pope is the Bishop of Rome. But these other seats, Constantinople, Syria, all these other seats begin to lose in influence in terms of the unified church. Of course, we realized that there were lots of other things going on in the church besides just worship development. There was an ongoing struggle with, was Jesus human? Was Jesus divine? What does it mean to believe? But the divinity thing was huge for 500 years until, the Nicene Creed was the definitive statement on the holy dual nature of Jesus. Yeah, good.
I thought that was all settled up at Nicaea. That still rumbled around after Constantine and the boys. Those were huge decisions they made.
And I believe, if I'm thinking right, the Nicene, the Council of Nicaea and the Nicene Creed, the whole idea that the dual nature of Christ wasn't the predominant view. There were two other views out there. The Gnostics, which you still see Gnostic thought. The Gnostics, Gnosis, which said that Jesus was spirit, presenting as human, and then it's not the Arian. Oh, it is the Arian. Arianism. Well, anyway, there's another. I can't think. I've been taking too many medications. I'll think about it in a minute. There was another that said that Jesus was pure human. Do you remember what that was, Peter? What is it? It's not the Arian. Arminianism. I'll think of it. It'll come to me.
But did the Gnostics say he was pure spirit?
Pure spirit. They were leaning towards.
Well, then what does that do to Genesis? God created man in His image. Well, He didn't have an image.
Well, that's part of the question, right?
Yeah,
it was much. Yeah, there was so much about this. For hundreds and hundreds of years, the church worried about this and went back and forth. All the while, the church was growing and thriving, and all the while, people were worshiping. But then forms begin to develop. So by the time we get to the late Middle Ages, 1300s to 1400s, we're in this situation where worship is highly ritualized. The priestly class, and this is all through the Roman Church and also into the Orthodox Church in Greek. There wasn't much of Roman was growing, but a Russian, but the Greek Orthodox, the priestly class had elevated powers. There were lowered powers for the laity, and even things like, by that time, the laity didn't receive wine, they only received the bread, if they received the bread. And how often you communed, and how often you prayed. And then there were other things that had developed in the church, like elaborate forms of confession, and elaborate rites for all the different sacraments that the Roman Church, the Western Church developed. Confirmation had become a rite of teaching and faith formation, but it became highly ritualized and highly some people would say, right? There wasn't a lot of life in it. Everything happened up at the altar with the priest, and not much down here for the people. Okay, so that's where we enter into the Reformations. So that's where Luther comes along. So I'm going to go grab that section of the slide. And since this isn't showing right, I'm off my...
Did they separate, when did the Eastern and Western churches separate?
Well,
was that before? That was before Luther, wasn't it?
Oh yeah. That was first schism, and that was sometime. I'm going to have to think back in my history, but that happened like in the late antiquity, early Middle Ages. Constantinople. Pardon me?
Somewhere around 1,000.
Yeah, somewhere around 1,000. Early Middle Ages, late antiquity.
That was pretty early then.
Yeah. See, here's the early Middle Ages, and that's when they split. Somewhere here came the other great. Do you remember, Nancy, when the other schism that happened when we all of a sudden had three popes? One in Avignon, France, one in Rome, and one somewhere else? Might have been in Germany.
So this whole thing with the Reformation, that schism had already taken place.
Oh, it always was taking place.
And were they, it sounds like, well, Luther was really complaining about the Roman Church, right?
Well,
How did the Eastern Church, did they have any input to this?
there was, the Eastern Church, they were locked into their own controversies, and, because they were butting up against Islam much more than the Western Church was, though there was butting up against Islam. The Western Church was also, there were influences into Russia and the Russians and their way of thinking, and Constantinople, or Byzantium, that became Constantinople, was the seat. And then there was just lots of things going on. The Greek versus the Greek Church was sort of recentered into Constantinople. I'm just going to focus here on the West, because what happened at the West is one of the most important things that happened in the Western Church in the Reformation is this recovery of sola scriptura, that the Bible itself, Scripture, is the ultimate authority in all matters of faith and all matters of practice. And what that did is it took the focus on the ritual, on the Mass itself, and how the Mass moves, and it removed it from that choreography and the priest actions as the leader of the choreography, and moved it to the sermon and the readings, which was a recovery of what was going on in the very, very early church, remember? Because you'd read, you'd sing songs, which are all based on Scripture, and now there was Scripture going on, but it had just sort of gotten to the point it wasn't the central focus. The focus was the action, the performative action in the Mass. Okay? So the next thing that happened, more about that, there was also this emphasis that faith comes on what is heard and not what's seen. That is a reaction to the performative aspect. Where faith, remember we talked about last week, in the late Middle Ages, before the Reformation, the emphasis of the worship leaders in the liturgy became how things were done. So if you'd ever been to a really, really high Mass at that time, the elevation of the host, the big elevation of the host, the beautiful, what do they call them, those beautiful big sunburst type of things with the host are reserved. All of that came, and then the buildings. Think of the buildings they built. All of those were creating this awe-inspiring visual of God's awe and God's presence. But Luther and Zwingli and Calvin and some of the others said, wait, that Bible tells us that faith comes by hearing the Word. That God speaks, faith to us. And this is recovering Galatians and some others. And so what happened, the Word began to supplant in many of the Reformation churches the ceremonies. And that emphasis also is where they began to attack the abuses, like the selling of indulgences, right? That was a superstitious abuse. And actually in the Counter-Reformation, they even recognize it. The Catholic Church to this day now recognizes it. But that's what was going on at the time. So there are other popular customs, like using of candles on Candle Mass, and ashes on Ash Wednesday, and palms on Palm Sunday. Some of the reformers, like the Calvinists especially, the Zwinglians, not the Lutherans, they maintain many of those customs. But the farther out Calvinists started just abolishing all that. They even went so far, like in England, to abolish Christmas celebrations, trees and things like that. And I think this is tied to Cromwell and his reformers, because Cromwell in England, his move was, he was Protestant, but he wasn't Lutheran Protestant, he was Reformed Protestant or Calvinist Protestant. They went and defaced all these statues at churches. I've been to England and been to a number of churches, and you go in these beautiful statues, the faces have been wiped off of them, just hammers and chisels, and they defaced them. That's where the word deface comes, where they defaced these sacred, or these scriptures dealing with sacred issues, right? They defaced them. knocked the wings off the angels. And
You know, when I went to the Catholic school for a while, they told us, this was a long time ago, that if Luther could have contained his Reformation and stayed within the Catholic Church, he undoubtedly would be a saint today, because it certainly needed.
You're right. But what happened is, in the middle of all that, there were political and social unrest, and that social unrest and the political intrigue between the German leaders in the Holy Roman Empire, which was the Germanic Empire, and then in Rome, that sort of carried Luther on, and he, for better or worse, and probably this is one of his more stubborn ways, he went along with it. You know, there was a peasants' revolt that he urged that be put down by the terrible, terrible thing. He spoke very ill of Jewish people early on. He came around later, but so everything Luther did wasn't perfect. Nothing was perfect. Some was bad, some was very brilliant. But he was a man who lived on the edge, right? He was sort of a late Middle Ages guy who helped pave the way into the Reformation and the Enlightenment and a new era.
Wasn't he helped by the printing presses coming out?
Oh my gosh, yeah.
He had done what he did without
No.
technology like that.
Well, think about it's Wycliffe, the English Bible composer. When he did the English translation, Wycliffe, had he had a printing press, and they could have disseminated that word earlier, but they didn't. So he ends up being burned at the stake, right? Wycliffe burned at the stake, and then later they dug him up and scattered his ashes, his remains in the Thames River. It's horrible stuff. I mean,
well, even when Calvin was around, he was after, or were their contemporaries?
They were contemporaries, yeah.
Did he say roast a couple people in Geneva?
Oh yeah.
And Calvin wasn't sure.
No. Calvin was, I'd say Luther was more of a moderate. He wanted to reform. Calvin was he was a reformer, but he led more towards the protest and leave. So his followers were more towards leaving the church.
Wasn't he a lawyer too? That explains something.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think he was.
Well, and Luther was a lawyer.
Well, yeah, Luther was a lawyer.
Yeah, that's right. He was.
First thing we do is kill all the lawyers.
He was a professor of law
He was a professor
at
of law.
the University of Wittenberg, and he didn't want to be there.
His dad
wanted to be there.
His dad was a nickel. Nickel
coal miner.
Well, wasn't it nickel too?
I've been to their house.
To the house, yeah.
In Iceland, and they show this picture of these guys taking coal out of the ground, laying on their stomachs in this coal seam that's about this high. And Luther had this vision of hell. That was his, when he was a kid growing up, people would go into these mines and the mines would collapse and they would die.
Yeah.
And that was that was a sure sign that there is a hell.
Yeah.
Well, Luther's his whole theology based on faith. He felt he was unworthy, right?
Always.
And he drove him crazy. And that said, then he said, well, didn't he say works mean nothing?
Yeah.
It's faith.
Right.
Yeah.
And but he sure got the word out.
Works mean everything, but it's only works for the neighbor. Works mean nothing as far as getting you salvation.
Right.
Salvation by grace through faith. The whole idea is that you're saved by grace through faith. Once you understand and accept that, then you are moved to work to the world. So read on being a Christian, his treatise on the freedom of the Christian. Because of faith, you are freed from all earthly bondage. But because you are freed and yoked to God, then you are a servant to the suffering world. And so it's interesting. But I don't want to get into that. I want to get into this liturgy stuff a little more. So what happened is, since the word needed to be understood, right? That's important. The word needed to be heard. The word was central. Liturgies then, in the Reformation, started to be put into the vernacular language. If we ought to study sometimes, or actually do, the German Mass, Luther basically took the Roman Mass at the time switched it around, put it into German, took some of the parts that the priest would be saying back to the people in front of the altar, saying just to the host or the quietly, and turned them around, and he made them speaking or singing parts for the people. And that was because the word was important, was primary. And also, since so much Christian liturgy is based on the Bible then, it was important that we got biblical translations. And then there just became this proliferation of Dutch and English and French and, well, the Huguenots, the French Huguenots have been the ones, German, Swedish, just for liturgical texts alone. But then that also so people could study, right? So people could study at home. Knowing that, but if they're going to study at home, it's important to have what? Be able to read. And so it's in the Reformation that they started some of the first, in the West, some of the first major efforts to teach children to read. The other thing is, if you're going to really truly help take care of your family, or take care of the poor, we should share what we have. And they started developing in Germany, through Lutherans, started developing the concept of the community chest. Now, I'm sure this existed in other cultures, but the community chest that we see on the Monopoly board, that came from people giving money, which that money was given out to the poor. That was part of their understanding of they've been freed and saved by what Christ has done, and they're free to do what? Help the neighbor. So I'm going to give 10% of my money, or I'm going to donate, I'm going to give my time, I'm going to go take care of the sick. When there's a plague, and there were plagues all over then, people stayed, good, faithful people stayed and took care, instead of rushing away and leaving the poor and the suffering to themselves. Okay. One thing that Lutheran worship did, probably more than the others, it especially featured congregational singing of vernacular, of your home language, not only to sing, but also as a way to teach. So what I really found out from Gracia Grindle, who is my hymn instructor, the Calvinists and the Reformed, they began to develop a hymn writing. They began to develop a practice and a theology of hymn writing that was paraphrase. So you look at a lot of those great hymns from some of the Presbyterian and Methodist and even Episcopal, they were influenced in some respects. Their hymns are quite often paraphrases of text. Lutherans wrote sermons. Good Lutheran hymns from the 1600s and the late 1500s, 1600s, 1700s are sermons. You go read A Mighty Fortress Is Our God. It's a darn sermon. You've got to read it all the way through. And it's beautiful because that's how they help teach the faith. That's how they help form faith. Yeah.
I often...
And Jim was going to say something. What?
There was much more literacy then than there is now. And if you learn it by a song, you remember it.
Yeah.
It's much easier than hearing it and remembering it. A song has that repetition, it stays with you.
So you remember when we started, when I first started education, or whatever this is, when we started doing the adult forums, we did a thing on the narrative lectionary. The same idea is that you learn faith through hearing the Word of God and the stories of God, right? Yeah, and it's that repetition. That's why when I get every once in a while I have the blessing of going and doing some pastoral care to somebody who's in their 90s or, in memory care. They might not remember who you are 30 seconds later, but they'll remember the Lord's Prayer. They'll remember the creed. They'll remember some of those old songs. It's unbelievable. And those things stick in your psyche and stick in your being.
I've often thought that we should discuss the theology of A Mighty Fortress, the words to A Mighty Fortress, because some of it's a little confusing.
Well, that'd be a good...
If you read through it.
We could do that, yeah. No, it's a really interesting, because
Yeah.
it's based on Psalm 93 or 4. But it's a sermon. It's a good Luther hymn.
Well, but there's some, I think there was some translation issues from German to English with how it is in our hymnal today.
Yeah. Gracia, I could go to Gracia and probably get it,
Yeah.
her translation, because this woman is in her mid-70s now and still translates every day a new
She's
hymn.
been here.
Yeah, use them at Gracia.
Where'd the Messiah come from?
Messiah? Well, Messiah was a concept of the second coming of David, or the coming of the second. To
What
restore.
church, what denomination?
Well, it came out of the Jewish tradition.
The Jews?
Oh yeah, the Messiah concept, the idea that Messiah is a Jewish idea.
To me, that's where I like to go. I don't know why, it just...
Well, that's where that early concept. Remember, we're a faith based upon. Part of our faith is based upon the stories of the people of Israel, God's revelation, and their witnesses. And
We're not even talking about Jesus then.
No, they're waiting for the
Messiah in general, their Messiah.
They're still looking for the Messiah
Yeah.
to come and to rescue.
Good.
Yeah. Christians saw Jesus as the Messiah. Christian Jews saw Jesus as the Messiah. Non-Christian Jews, the Gentiles, I believe they saw Jesus in a little different way because they didn't need a Messiah. They needed a deliverer because the church really first went out to those who were under the poorest. I studied one semester world history, world religion and witness mission, and I got to study the history of Lutheran mission in India. And what was fascinating are the people that it just went like wildfire were the untouchables, the Dalit, the lowest caste,
Yeah.
because they were nothing in their culture.
Still aren't.
Still aren't, even though you can't be.
Well, yeah,
Still,
officially.
low caste, right? Yeah. A couple other things about the Reformation. Holy Communion was celebrated less frequently than the Roman Mass had been by some churches. So communion wasn't celebrated very frequently. It was the Roman Mass was celebrated every time. But the people in pews or in the stalls or whatever, they didn't receive they might receive 1, 2, 3 times a year.
Mm-hmm.
Though the Mass was, because everything happened, right? Priest, that was the idea and the performative nature of it. But people, they didn't give Mass to the regular people, and never in full kinds, or rarely in those latter days. So what happened is, some of the Reformed churches, not Lutherans necessarily, they even celebrated Mass less frequently than Catholics, not every week, not every time they had a Mass, maybe once a month. But what happened is, the emphasis was placed on everybody receiving, the whole congregation receiving communion. Then, even though celebrations of communion were reduced to sometimes 3 or 4 times a year, the faithful received the communion more frequently than had they been when they were in a Roman Catholic church. They might get it once a year because they didn't receive that much, even though the Mass happened every time. So these are all these things that were happening. Really fascinating stuff. Luther, one of his contemporaries, Martin Bucer, and John Calvin, with the Calvinists, they preferred Holy Communion every Sunday and festival. And as long as there was somebody to receive, now there's another deal. As long as there was somebody to receive, the Lutherans in the early times of the Reformation would have communion. There was one person, they'd have communion. In the Roman Church, if nobody was there, the Mass happened anyway, right? Because it was a different approach. The emphasis went to those who received, the communicants.
Well, when I was in the Catholic Church as a kid, the congregation never got the wine.
Right.
Only that's why he was half drunk. He was up there drinking the wine. And the whole congregation got the host.
Yeah.
I don't know what they do now, but...
Well, no, after Vatican II, that changed.
Yeah, there was...
and Roman Catholics receive both kinds, wine and bread. Except there are some conservative ones who still hold to some of, they're still doing Latin Masses, even though in Vatican II, They eliminated the requirement of the Latin Mass, and they wanted them to do what they'd done in
Didn't
the
the
Reformation.
Pope open that up a little bit?
Open it up to the regular language, right?
Yeah, 'cause when I was a kid, that's all I had, was Latin.
Latin.
You know, you didn't know what you're talking about.
No, they were just up there. But it was all about, but the magic, if I want to say magic, but the awe and the drive was what? It was the pageantry and the presentation and the priest and the garb and the mystery of it all.
Well, they told us, 'cause I asked the question, of course, why not English? Well, the answer came back because we are the Catholic means universal. We are the universal church. We want it to be the same everywhere.
Right.
Whether you understand it or not is another issue.
And that's one of those things that begin in the Middle Ages, right? That's one of those things that began in the Middle Ages when Rome became the main form. It could have been Antioch, right? It could have been
Yeah.
Syria. And then the church would be speaking Syrian. But it turned out to be Rome and Latin. Not Italian, but Rome and Latin, which was the official.
But you're saying it all kind of comes back to Charlemagne, or is that kind of a stretch?
Well, no, it comes back, there's just all these incremental steps.
Or he raised the Bishop of Rome
Right,
above everybody.
right, in the West.
In the West, yeah, we're
And
not
then the
talking,
East sort of,
that's a different
about the
version.
time of that schism, that's somewhere around there. I can't remember exactly when Charlemagne was. Was it about 1000?
I think Charlemagne was 800 something.
Yeah, so right around then that schism happened with the Greeks.
Just
And,
in case you want to know where Charlemagne is right now at this moment, his leg bone is in the cathedral at Aachen, Germany. It's a relic inside of a gilded box. It's about this big.
his leg bone.
His leg bone.
Yeah, that was something. Some of these special people and some of the saints in Middle Ages times, they would dig them up and, they would,
relics.
the bones and stuff would be spread out all over as relics then.
Well, any Catholic church in those days had to have a relic, like I went to St. Andrew's Church, which doesn't exist anymore, over in Como Park.
They had a relic?
Well, I never saw
They
it,
all have.
but that was the theory. It was somewhere below the altar, and I don't know if it had to be a bone or not, but something that was attached to this saint.
A piece of the wood from the cross.
Yeah.
That would be a relic.
Well, I'm gonna tell you guys, if you want a relic from me, you're gonna get some fingernail clippings. Pick up the toenail clippings, and that's gonna give that all. But we're not going back there. So, the other thing is that this practice, even though they opened up the table to everyone and did it more often, at the same time, they began to fence the table, right? To say, well, you gotta be a certain type of person, you gotta behave in a certain way, you have to parent a certain way, you have to be a member. And so in the churches, they began to some of us grew up in the Lutheran churches where you had to announce your knowledge of the catechism and examine your moral lives publicly before you could commune, right? That was one of those things that happened in the Reformation too, because something jumps forward and then there's a counter reaction, right? Something jumps one way and there's a reaction the other way. You know, every action is an equal and opposite reaction, physically, in terms of physics, but also in terms of society. It's a sociological thing. I could say we elected our first black American president, and then there was a reaction to that in some respects. I think you mentioned that last week, Cliff, is that sociologically that happens with people too. So, fence the table though, when they started fencing the table and putting on, and Missouri Synod still does, this, the Wisconsin Synod still does this. They're not necessarily all churches are not active, but the official policy is that in some Lutheran churches, you have to meet certain standards in order to receive. So it loses its center as gift and becomes a transactional thing. So yeah.
If you go through the Lutheran seminary, do you pick, or like could you go, Wisconsin, a pastor in Wisconsin, or a Missouri Synod, or are you pretty much ELC?
No. Luther Seminary, probably about 65% of the students there are Lutheran. but there are people, Moravians and Methodists and Presbyterians and Episcopalians, and you're not going to get a Missouri Synod in Wisconsin because their candidacy thing will require you to go to a Missouri Synod or Wisconsin seminary. Ours don't. You do have at this point, you have to have a year of Lutheran instruction. So I have lots of friends who went to Yale and Princeton, Duke, Fuller in California, which is an evangelical. Lots of good Lutheran pastors, but they might have finished up a year here at Luther. So, but in some of these others, they keep the formation and the ordination stuff a little tighter. So one more thing. Luther was not a mind. He didn't want to discard the Catholic Mass, the Latin Mass. He loved the Mass. Because on its form, the way it flowed and stuff, especially the way the Word worked, the gathering, the Word, the meal, and the sending, that's that basic order, worked. He just wanted to, he instituted the German Mass as well, just in German language. And early on, Latin remained in the city, German remained in the village, because in the cities, like in Wittenberg, it was an academic city. There are more people who understood it.
I would say Wittenberg is more of a village than a city.
Oh, yeah.
An outpost.
Mm-hmm.
But it still had the school there, the university.
True.
Yeah. So, Western Catholicism became specifically Roman. Okay, so this is when it happened. In the Council of Trent, okay, which happened as a response to so in the 1500s is when the announcement that you had to, all Western Catholics had to conform to Rome. The Bishop of Rome and the Roman rites. All had to be there. That's when Rome got its basic power. Its final power. Okay, then after the Reformation, there was a time of response as far as liturgy and history goes. So I'm going to try to go these fast. In England and in other places, you saw this almost legalistic standardization and a forced uniformity. So this is how Mass is to be run. This is how the worship works. This is what you have to do. These are the rules. So pastors, the priests, the pastors, you had to do things in certain right and good order, right? We saw that become more and more encoded. So, and then it also led to a reaction. So then the Puritans and the Pietists and the Jansenists and the Swiss, the German Reform said, the heck with all that law, we're going to do things our own way. So there was this move away from the uniformity of that sort of Roman tradition, and they started doing worship a little bit different. Okay? Especially the Scots. But they never got away along with anybody anyway, because they were Scottish. And in England, they split into from what was the Church of England, split into the Anglican, which remained the High Church of England, the Presbyterians, which were also aligned with the Scots, the Congregationalists, and the English Baptists. So those four main. So we had to see all these Protestant splits, and everybody did stuff a little bit differently. And in the middle of that, alongside the Lutheran and Catholic traditions, the Lutherans remained fairly formal. Okay, they still maintain that traditional ordo, much of what we still have in our liturgy. But then you begin to have Spener and Hoga, which were two Lutheran pietists who were influenced by these kind of guys and these kind of guys. And there were Roman pietists who said, we need to loosen things up. And so then we begin to see different forms of worship that didn't have as much pomp, as much circumstance. Looked at communion different. Communion wasn't the presence of Christ. Communion was a memorial. Jesus wasn't truly present. We just remember this. So you don't have to do it all that often. And More emphasis put on preaching, so they had these 40, 50 minute, 60-minute sermons, lots of song, things like that. But there were, so the Norwegian church that came to America, Norwegian Americans here, a lot of the Norwegian Americans who settled into the North Dakota, South Dakota, and upper Minnesota, they were Haugies. They were pietist Lutherans, which is different than the ones who settled in the East in the early days, or the Swedes, who were still high church, so that's why when we started coming back together, there was all this wrangling.
Is there still a pietist Lutheran church?
No,
Is it gone?
they were so religious they forgot how to reproduce.
Oh, no.
They just quit.
You will never hear the name Spangerud. It's a very Norwegian name.
They never had children.
They didn't have children.
You gotta
No.
kidding.
No, I'm not kidding.
So then they kind of get themselves out of business.
Yeah, they
Where-
framed themselves out of business.
Where did Luther
Okay.
stand on, Catholics are big on confession.
Yeah,
You cannot go to communion without confession.
yeah.
But that doesn't exist in the Lutheran church.
Well, Luther thought confession was so important, but it wasn't eventually, in his mind, a sacrament. It almost became the third Lutheran sacrament. That was replaced by beer and hymns, by the way, or coffee hour. Lutefisk and coffee hour.
Don't forget the left side.
And the left side, yeah. But that's different. That's a little bit different. But so confession became, in the Lutheran tradition, we still can do, and I've done individual confession, but corporate confession. So we did that confession of forgiveness at the beginning of worship. That's our practice.
But you don't have the power to remove sin, or the Catholic priest does.
We have the power to pronounce that God is Lutheran.
Right, but you're announcing that
Yeah.
because Jesus died. You're just
We're not given.
You're the messenger on this one, but the Catholics, that priest has a lot of power,
Right.
and he's lifting sins, mortal and venial,
Yeah.
and
that's one of the big differences right now between the churches. Probably that more than anything. So when
getting back to what Cliff was saying, in the Greek community, if you tell someone, God bless you, they'll tell you, only the priest can bless me.
So think about the power in these different traditions. Think about the power of the priest or the pastor, right? Luther and Lutherans and most of the Reformed said the pastor doesn't have the power, but we are given the power to proclaim. Well, they say to take away sins, but we have the power. And I see it as not as, I don't have any magic dust or any magic power, but I have a call to proclaim that. And so when I do proclaim that to somebody, I take it very seriously because it's just not out of my mouth just to say, oh, you're forgiven. I mean, this is a powerful thing for people, especially when you've got the collar on. People respond differently to the position, to the office. So we ended up having these pietistic influences in Lutheran. And those pietistic, by the way, when people started coming here, those practices went with them. With the Swedes came, the High Church Swede sort of formal liturgy, and some of the High German liturgy went with them. When the Haugian, very plain Hauga or Haugian Norwegians, and the Finns, and some of the others came together, those specific practices and the way they worshiped came with them. But they were all what Luther would call adiaphora, other things, not essential things. What stayed was grace by the word and sacraments, and the understanding that we are saved by grace through faith, and the understanding that Christ meets us in the cross. I mean, sort of those are the things that were the main things. Luther would say, make the main thing the main thing. Sometimes in talking about some of these things. He didn't get into where Calvin wrote pages upon pages. What was Calvin? Nancy, the Calvin's big theological book. What was it called? Calvin wrote like chapters. Yeah, anyway, he wrote this big chapter. Luther wrote sermons and an occasional paper.
Well, there's no big differences. And I got a problem with it. I did a little study on Calvin. He believed in predestination.
Yep.
Luther didn't.
No.
No way, shape, or form would I ever believe in predestination.
No.
Maybe it's my Catholic they believe in free will.
Right.
And that shuts me down to Calvin right now.
Right. But Calvin, you see, and then I don't want to look at Calvin Day because how they worship them that informs how the way they go about things. So, we had these pietistic, but during the Post-Reformation, there was little development. The liturgical forms, the order of worship, the way things flowed, didn't change much outside of the Free Church, which was the Pietists. But there was, in most Roman and Lutheran, this flourishing of arts and music. And that's when, like, these great Lutheran hymnal writers, Gerhard and Oleander and so on and so forth, these great German chorales in the 1600s, they flourished in the Post-Reformation. Two more things I'll make it really quick. Each group began to harden their position. Our position is right, and yours is wrong. I mean, so this happened in the Post-Reformation. So they hardened their confessional positions as they reflected in their liturgical practices. So they began to say, no, we do liturgy right, you do it wrong, instead of more free-flowing. The other thing, Holy Communion doctrine, Holy Communion began to be differentiated by different gestures. So in the Roman Church, the solemn benediction of the Blessed Sacrament, this very careful touch of the body of Christ and the blood of Christ and the sacristy and all that, was because they're understanding that this was the true body and blood of Christ in everything except the way it looked, right? In transubstantiation. The Reform, they stressed breaking bread and the students and communicants, and much of that Reform practice is the one we were doing with the little. Everybody got their bread and then they all took it together, right? As a sign of unity. But the Lutherans would elevate the bread and the cup and proclaim verbally that this is the true body and blood of Christ. Remember, this is pre-Vatican II, so a lot of this stuff happened quietly in the early church, in the early Roman church. Lutherans began to say, this is the body and blood of Christ, and that's one of the reasons I continue to say in those Eucharistic prayers, may the Spirit be present here. You know, it's an invocation in the bread, in the wine, so that they are for us as you promised, your true body, your true blood. Okay. Enlightenment. Okay, right after that, then comes the Enlightenment. And what happened in the church, that many of the Lutheran churches in Germany, Sweden, Norway were tied so much to the government that what they did was somewhat regulated by law because they were tied closely. There wasn't a separation of church and state. And there were some variations. Then Lutherans began to move, not Lutherans only, Reform and Lutherans, the Protestants, begin to move away from worship being oriented and existing primarily to, instead of to edify the clergy or the whole church, begin to the edification of individual people. Because the emphasis in the Enlightenment was on the glory of human potential, right? Humanism, Enlightenment. So it moved towards individual edification, and it was a big swing. And then the impact of the Protestant church is much more than the Catholic. Catholic was big enough, and for Lutherans, word and sacrament sort of fell out of balance. Why do we have to have communion every week, Pastor?
Exactly.
Can't we just do this once a month? Because it'd be easier.
Once a year would be good.
Yeah, once a year would be good, because it's about what we get, right? It's about our comfort.
How many times do you have to have communion to be saved?
Yeah.
The Protestants,
Not a one.
the Presbyterians only have it once a month.
Yeah.
In Arizona, isn't that up to the individual church?
Yeah. Well, it depends. So, communion in the Lutheran Church, because of that, began to be practiced less. Because there was this fear that it would lose its meaning. Because the focus became on the human experience. So am I going to find this stale, and it's not going to mean as much to me? And the focus went from what God does in the bread and the wine, in the Word, and the Word's for you, to what do I get out of it, right? That's part of the Enlightenment switch. And that's something a lot of church that really affected Lutheran churches in America. And in some of the congregations we've grown up with, I grew up in Missouri Synod. You must announce your intent to receive, be examined by the pastor. And sometimes that happened during confirmation, but I remember my good Swedish Lutheran LCA Augustana grandmother, Martha Friedberg, coming to our little Missouri Synod church. And somebody mentioned, well, you ought to go talk to the pastor. And she goes, I'm a lifelong Lutheran. I'm not going to talk to no blankety-blank pastor. Well, she just wouldn't commune, right? But that was the difference between those two, even within the Lutheranism. And in this period of Enlightenment, confirmation, the rite of confirmation was restored in Lutherans, not as a sacrament like it was in the Roman Catholic Church, but as a rite of passage. This is what kids do when they get to a certain age. You graduate from Sunday school, it becomes a rite of passage, okay? But that wasn't something that was all along. It was only half of the Lutheran tradition to this date even had confirmation. First communion in many churches was delayed until after confirmation. I had my first communion the Sunday after confirmation.
That would be in the Catholic Church.
No.
Confirmation is, First Communion is enormous.
Huge.
In the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had ours on Confirmation Sunday.
Yeah.
We communed that day.
We being the next Sunday. We had Sunday, so on.
You guys must have been remedial.
We were remedial Missouri. So I was confirmed on one Sunday, and I got a Bible, okay, my RSV, black, with my name stamped on it in gold, which our dog chewed part of the cover off. And then the next week I got my hymnal with my name on it because I had my first communion, right? As important, on my confirmation Sunday, I got my first cup of coffee because Grandma Martha always gave her kids their first cup of coffee on confirmation Sunday. And they all wore white. All the ladies came in white, except my mom, who grew up in
I got my first missal when I got my first, which is a number of years ago.
Yeah.
I still have it. My mother got it for me.
Yeah, you saved it? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I don't use it, but, yeah, I got it. It's a keepsake.
So out of all this, you have the Reformation happens, lots of upheaval, the Enlightenment comes along, and the Reformation helped pave that way in Europe. Then you had two strong actions to the Enlightenment. And one was called, and you're going to really recognize American religion here. One was called Revivalism. And you've heard about the First and Second Great Awakening and these revival churches. So, revivals started, they occurred in the mid-1800s in England, in Britain, and started with John and Charles Wesley, were two of the major characters there, which led to the emergence of Methodism. And in British North America in the 1740s, so mid-18, that same time, and then an Anglican preacher, George Whitefield, came to America, and he brought the revival to the British North American colonies, the British colonies. He didn't mess with the Swedes. There was a Swedish colony down in South Carolina. He didn't mess with the Dutch. He went to the Brits, right? And he became probably the first real celebrity. And we love celebrity, we Americans. And his work reshaped Congregational, Presbyterian, Dutch Reformed, and German Reformed denominations. And it also strengthened these small Baptist and Catholic denominations because they introduced some new things, or different things, which were percolating out there in the middle of the Reformation. This is just this is how things sort of flow out. Revivalism, the Wesleys, Methodism, Whitefield American colonies. And one of the things that they did first were these American frontier camp meetings. Okay, they had camp meetings and stuff back when people were gathered. It was on the frontier in Kentucky and Ohio and Pennsylvania, away from the Lutherans and away from the Dutch, right, the Pennsylvania Dutch. But where the world was going, as the United States was expanding, they had these camp meetings. And these camp meetings were big. People would camp out and they'd have speakers, and women would pass out, and guys would get all excited and chase around. But they introduced a basic 3-part worship form. Sort of 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 warm-up songs, 2 some scripture and some preaching, and then an altar call. And early it was communion, but then they dropped that and they moved to something called the anxious bench. So if you felt anxious about your life in Christ, you could come up to the anxious bench and you could be... Now, go look at TV, Sunday morning TV, and or go to a Pentecostal church today, or a fundamentalist church, or Hillsong, or Eaglebrook, right? Warm-up songs, some good musicians, light show, bands, some scripture, and a lot of preaching. Not a lot of scripture, a lot of preaching. And then an altar call. Right?
Why are these mega churches that you're describing seem to be getting huge and huge, where the traditional church seems to be kind of dying?
Well, they seem to be. Research is showing that they're growing and then they're flopping. There was one called Mars Hill in Chicago, which is almost dead. The Crystal Cathedral, Robert Schuller.
It's Catholic going now.
Well,
Yeah, I think
Schuller died, so...
Schuller died and nobody could...
But his daughter messed it up, didn't
Well,
she?
you know what, but here's the thing. Schuller was a character. What do they call about the something about celebrity and popularity.
Charisma.
You know, the charisma, right? And Schuller died. And now it's like a glorified donut stand or something.
You know,
they sold the Crystal Creamer.
The Catholics bought it.
Yeah, the Catholics have it.
I don't know what they're doing with it, but...
It would make a beautiful Catholic worship space with all the glass and stuff. Oh, and the way Catholics do it up with the high mass. It would be
But
beautiful.
overall, if you look at the total picture in the United States, would you say, in your opinion, that it's growing or going down? I go out here on the street, and the parking lots are full. And to me, it's because they got that, what do they call that
That's
stuff?
the Church of the Seventh-day Salesman over here on White Bear Avenue.
And,
Used to
but they
be
got
Elder
that,
Square.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
they got that,
They're a good church.
it's okay to own 6 Cadillacs in your, is that real Christianity anyway? I don't know.
This is a really interesting form of worship. This is the church. This is the form that the black church in the United States has taken.
Is that really Christianity?
Yeah, it's Christianity. It's just a different form. Now you can start to debate the dogma around what do they believe and stuff.
Yeah.
But
Dogma and doctrine.
dogma, doctrine,
Dogma
karma.
and doctrine.
My karma ran over my dogma.
I get a bunch of rich people that are trying to soothe their conscience,
Well,
but
those
I'm dead wrong.
here's the thing about these mega churches, right? High, immediate emotional reward, the music, the thumping, low commitment, because you can slip in there and slip right out and nobody notices you.
So they're not the intellect.
Well, and emotion is important. I mean, we do need as church to deal with emotions. much of Lutheran and Roman Catholic, and we are really an offshoot of Roman Catholicism more than anything, it deals with that sense of awe or music, but it's a certain type of music. You know, I've been to some amazing worship with drums and dancers and some of these other things. We'll get to that, but this is what happened in America. This is the revivalism. And revivalism itself, I don't want to, we're going to run long here in a minute. Oh, we already run long. Little attention was paid to the church here. They didn't care about Advent. They're recovering it now. And some of them didn't even worship Christmas as a Christian thing, because somehow they thought that it had too many pagan influences. So they paid Christmas and Easter, but that was about it. No liturgical year. Lent, you know. And they rejected a lot of what the church in the West had already brought about. And then they began to embrace, I think this is one of the most famous, they began to embrace civil festivals. So, Christmas and Easter were important, but they were no more important than Memorial Day, or Thanksgiving, or Independence Day. And so when you go to some of these traditions, you'll notice things like the flag and other things become important symbols for them in worship. Because there, it's a revival, and it's a conflating between faith and other lifestyle practices and the country. And I don't want to go too deep.
Are there concrete churches that have this?
What?
Revivalism, like today?
Oh, yeah.
Because I think of them in like Billy Graham or something.
Eaglebrook Church over in...
Eaglebrook. Graham was a revivalist.
So something I would look at Eaglebrook is an enormous mega church. That's revivalism.
It comes out of revivalism, yes. It's that second or third generation.
Yep.
But remember the revival, this was happening where they'd have these big camp meetings alongside a river or a lake, and everybody'd come, and the girls would promenade for the boys, and they'd have food, and they'd have speeches and stuff, and then they'd have these big worships, and this was the form, the liturgical form it had become. As the West was settled, as Westerners moved into the center part of the country, and the country solidified in ways, revivalism dropped off a little bit because there were no more places to go. There wasn't as much country to go to. But at the same time as revivalism was this move to Romanticism. And it was a reaction to say, look, worship doesn't exist for the worshiper. Worship exists for God. Soli Deo Gloria. That worship exists for the sake of God. And so in the Romance period, they began to, both Lutherans and Reformed, and the Catholics too, started like, let's bring back some of those really beautiful parts of worship that we might have ignored over the years. The music, the pomp, the circumstance, the colors, I hear you do a great liturgical dance.
I do.
Okay, that's what I thought.
No.
What church would be Romanticism?
It affected Lutherans.
There is a lot of Lutherans that would be considered?
You see it. If you were to think about the Lutheran, the different churches before the merger, that would have been affected more by Romanticism than by revivalism, would be like the United Lutheran Church, the American Lutheran, not American, the LCA, the Augustana Synod, some of the other synods that were either based in, that weren't the high church. Revivalism probably still had an effect on things like the Haugism, the low church Norwegians, the low church Germans, the high church, low church. So the high church tradition, Romanticism, we started seeing that pop up to influence.
So Lutheranism really isn't Lutheran, it's a collection of different traditions.
Well, what it is there's a continuum of influences that move in the beginning, and it continues to move. It's not a static thing. I think that's why I went so deep into this survey, is that worship and liturgy is linked, but it's this long survey, this long bit of change and adaptation and pushback and jump forward, and it's like a dance.
It's still changing then too.
We're still changing, yeah. So During the Romanticism period, you saw moves in some Lutheran churches to what they called evangelical Catholic, where by form they begin to look more Catholic. That happens a lot in Eastern Lutheran churches. A couple of years back, my son and I went to New York for a football game, and the Super Bowl. And the day I got tickets somehow, and I said, I want to go to church at the Super Bowl. So we went to this ELCA church that occupied, its original land is where like this 80-story tower is. Some big bank, Chase Morgan or something. But they carved out, they built around their space, they built the building. And then they had this new worship space. And I took Matt into this beautiful worship space. And we sat down, and here out come the pastors. And one pastor's wearing a full chasuble, big full chasuble. He's the one who's going to preside. Another guy had on what they call a cope, which is another fancy. He's the one who's going to preach. And everybody, the choir, and they had incense. I mean, the whole bit. And Matt looked at me. He looked at me and said, "I thought we were going to go to a Catholic church." He said, "Are we in a Catholic church?" Because he went to Catholic school. He did Catholic Mass every day at school. "Are we in a Catholic church?" I said, "No, this is Lutheran church." "No, this is a Catholic church." That is that evangelical Catholic. And there's a movement. There are lots of churches and more tied to urban areas. You're going to see more of the Haugen low church in country areas, rural areas. And then you had the retrieval of historic Lutheran liturgy. So by the time we got the Lutheran hymn book that we probably would know, the one in 1888, all American Lutherans finally put together, not all of them, but most of them, this 1888 book. And it reflected some of the early practices of the early church in the 1600s. Okay? So, what's now? Well, there's been we had those two important moves that led to what the modern church is. Revivalism led to a Pentecostalism in the Azusa Street revival in in LA. And then on the Romantic side was this Lutheran Renewal movement, which is Liturgy Renewal movement, which is really exciting. So the modern liturgical renewal is more impactful for Lutheran Church, especially the ELCA. And here's some of the characteristics, and I'll leave it at that. Frequent celebration and reception of communion. So during this modern move is when many Lutheran churches in ELCA tradition have moved to weekly communion, every Sunday and festival Sundays. And liturgy itself is seen as the work of the people of God. This is what we do in response to what God is doing for us. We still elevate what God is doing in our worship, but we don't do it we do it as a witness and a connection. And the role of people has been enhanced, right? So, and this happens in the Catholic Church too. People read Scripture. People lead prayers of the people. Regular people bring the gifts to the offering. They celebrate they assist with communion. Those things didn't happen 80 years ago. And liturgy has expressed the corporate life and mission of the church. So, what I want to do next week is sit down with this overview, and then I'll have maybe a handout that hits some of the highlights. Then I'm going to look at our liturgy now, one of our liturgies, and we can begin to go through and see where some of those pieces have come, and what the order is, and why we do them, and what is truly essential to worship in the Lutheran tradition. What would you say is essential?
Confession.
Question?
Confession.
Confession? I think confession is, because it's tied to what I think the primary is word and sacrament. We are a preaching church. So word, read, sung, preached, and sacrament. And that confession is tied to the sacrament, but not necessary to the sacrament. We can talk more about that. I love having confession at most worships, but we don't have to at all. There's other times where a remembrance of baptism is as important Because the truth of the matter is, when we proclaim, in the words of institution, that this is the blood of Christ given for you for forgiveness of sins, well, there's your forgiveness of sins right there embedded in the bread and wine, the body and blood.
You brought this up last week about consubstantiation and there's a big difference.
Yeah. And that's, both of those are dealing with the idea that both are ways to express and try to explain how can God be present in bread and wine. And it really, one has to do with an understanding of the actual change and everything but what its accidents are, what it looks like. And the other, that is, we can't explain what the change is, but we believe and trust that God is in with and under. Christ is in with us.
It sounds like semantics.
Well, it is and it's not, because I could get into communion. We could do a whole thing on communion later. Would you like me in?
Words are important.
And I know it's going. Any other questions, folks? This is a lot. I know this is a lot, but I just wanted you to see how complex and interesting. There are these threads of how things have developed. And in some respects, the things we do right now aren't that different than what was being done after the Edict of Milan. In other ways, they're very different. But we know we're not doing what the revivalists did.
Are you going to have anything on futures? That's tough.
No, I think we can talk. I have a...
Like, this is how it is today, but going forward, understanding things change by the minute, that, all caveats.
I would love to...
This is what I see.
Well, here's... Okay, and I'll give you the preview, because I'd love to do this. I don't... And this is part of what my specific interest, as if there's an academic interest to my work as a pastor, has to do is how do we respond to the future? And in American church in the last five decades or so, we've adopted strategic planning practices, just like businesses.
Yeah.
But the church is not a business. It's different. In a business, you have your stakeholders, and the stakeholders are primarily the owners and the investors, and maybe the employees, and then maybe they're the people who buy your product. The church, the stakeholders are one, God, but also the suffering world. So we're called to love the neighbor. So the stakeholders. So what does it mean? How do we see who we are? And let's go over here. If we're right here, and this is how time moves along. Let's say we're right here. How do we know where God is calling us to be? Well, the practice has been by adapting these practices, these things, we're going to say, well, we really need to be here. And we're going to cast a vision, and we're going to do a strategic plan to get us out here, so by year 5, we're here. What happens? COVID, right? Wipes it all out. I'm working, and I've been working on, what if we forget casting what we think we need to be doing in the future, and we learn to be, as a people, as a congregation, more open to what the Spirit is calling us to right now. And that's practicing. There's ways to practice and learn that, so that when a homeless woman who needs to get her trailer off the street before they tow it and throw it away, and she's out on the street with a storm coming with nothing, we can say, oh, you can park in our lot, and there's not a big deal. We can say, oh, look, there's need at John Glenn. We're going to go and do what we're doing. And you're agile, you know who God has gifted you, and you're aware of what God, you can become more aware as a community what God might be calling you to. But it's Spirit-led, or a Spirit, we follow the Spirit, we follow the signs that are given to us.
That's good, but we're you human,
Yeah. Yeah.
I get overwhelmed. The need is great. Nobody's gonna argue that, right?
Yeah,
The little bit the human can do,
yeah. So I think.
very little.
But I think that's something we can get to. I don't want to bore anybody too much. Did I bore anybody? Did anybody fall asleep yet? Now, these first two ones there's a lot, but we're gonna get into sort of looking through the liturgy point by point. It'll be real fun. And maybe I'll get my computer connected to my thing. Bless you all. Be